Hello, my name is Katie. I'm a neurodivergent coach and community builder in Portland, Oregon. I know why I'm giving such a long intro, but I am here today to read a book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Weller, foreword by Michael Lerner. So, preface. This book is about rituals of renewal and the sacred work of grief. I'm very excited. I have a really hard time reading and finishing books, and I think it's the only way I've successfully finished an actual tangible book that I've read on paper is by recording myself reading it. So I'm going to do that again. I'm pretty sure I can only record in like half-hour periods, or it divides the video into half-hour periods, so I'll just see what happens. I also think this is a new phone since the last time I did, so we'll see. But I have really been wanting to read this book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, and I haven't. Today was the first day I managed to pick it up out of the office and say, okay, I'm going to start reading it. So here I am reading it. I will warn you, I had hot chocolate, so I'm going to be a little congested because my body doesn't love dairy as much as I do. And reading is challenging for me, so if you want this book to just be lovingly read to you, I highly suggest finding the audiobook. If you want this book to be messily read to you, then welcome, you're in the right place. I'm going to have some tea. I'm going to pound the floor so it doesn't make a loud noise every time I put it down. Okay, let's get started. This book is I'm sorry if you hate this, but I have to. This book is too white. Look at how white it is. It's too white and it's too stiff. I'm sorry I'm judging you already, book, but I need you to be openable. And I know some people, this is horrific to them that I'm bending this book this way, but it's my book, and I'll do what I want because I want to read it, and that's the most important thing. Okay. The Wild Edge of Sorrow. I keep wanting to say the art of sorrow because it feels so appropriate, but it's not. It's the edge. Rituals of Renewal and the Sacred Work of Grief by Francis Weller, foreword by Michael Lerner. Okay. Do we want to read the acknowledgments? Not really. I think I already read them. Foreword by Michael Lerner. Michael Lerner is president and founder of Commonweal in Bolinas, California. Founded in 1976, Commonweal has programs in health and healing, education and the arts, and the environment and justice. Wow, really covered all the bases there. Lerner is co-founder of the Commonweal Cancer Help Program, the Collaborative on Health and the Environment, and the New School at Commonweal. Really likes Commonweal, I can tell. Survive, Love, and Loss. The great French essayist Michael de Montaigne advised, I have to start over. Survive, Love, and Loss. The great French essayist Michael de Montaigne advised. His maxim for life compresses the essence of the human dilemma into 4 words. Easier said than done, for loss is the other side of the coin of love. The greater the love, the greater the loss, and yet different people respond to loss very differently. When it comes to loss, there are hard-earned skills that can help you survive the unknown terrain in which you find yourself. There are survival skills, there are maps, and there are guides. Francis Weller is a well-traveled guide to the country of loss. He can teach you the survival skills. He can show you the maps. He carries his knowing of sorrow in his bones. He writes as someone who has been unmade in the way loss unmakes us. He is not afraid to tell us so. I'm not sure how or when I began my apprenticeship with sorrow. I do know that it was my gateway back into the breathing and animate world. It was through the dark waters of grief that I came to touch my unlived life. There is some strange intimacy between grief and aliveness, some sacred exchange between what seems unbearable and what is most exquisitely alive. Through this, I have come to have a lasting faith in grief. Weller co-leads week-long retreats with me in the Commonweal Cancer Health Program. We sit together many evenings in these retreats and hear stories of love and loss. We know that listening and honoring these stories makes a difference. He also leads his own retreats on grief and loss. I know some of those who have attended his retreats. I know from their accounts that these retreats too make a difference. The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal, and the Sacred Work of Grief brings together Weller's wisdom from decades of work with grief and loss. Every one of us must undertake an apprenticeship with sorrow. We must learn the art and craft of grief, discover the profound ways it ripens and deepens us. While grief is an intense emotion, it is also a skill we develop through a prolonged walk with loss. Facing grief is hard work. It takes outrageous courage to face outrageous loss. This is precisely what we are being called to do. One of Weller's most original contributions is his delineation of the 5 gates of grief. This will be my focus in the following few pages. The first gate he simply describes as everything we love, we will lose. The book is rich in discerning quotations, and here he quotes a 12th century poem. "'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch. To love, to hope, to dream, and oh, to lose. A thing for fools this love, but a holy thing, to love what death can touch." This first gate is known to all of us. The second gate surprises us, the places we have not known love. This is, to my mind, original and important. Weller writes, "These are the places within us that have been wrapped in shame and banished to the furthest shores of our lives. These neglected pieces of soul live in utter despair. The proper response to any loss is grief, but we cannot grieve for something that we feel is outside the circle of worth. The third gate of grief is the sorrows of the world. This gate is more familiar. In the Cancer Help Program, we ask on our entry form to list major losses before a cancer diagnosis. A surprising number of people list grief at what is happening in the world as a grief they have long lived with. And indeed, grief at the suffering of the world has long been known as a fundamental human dilemma. Suffering exists is the first noble truth of the Buddha. How to face suffering is at the heart of the great religious and philosophical traditions. The cumulative grief of the world is overwhelming. How can we possibly stay open to the endless assaults on the biosphere? Weller asks. He then quotes Naomi Nye's beautiful lines. "Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows, and you see the size of the cloth." Weller's fourth gate is what we expected and did not receive. Again, this is to me an original observation. Deep in our bones lies an old intuition that we arrive here carrying a bundle of gifts to offer to the community. In a sense, it is a form of spiritual employment. Hidden within the losses at this gate lies our diminished experience of who we truly are. Weller calls the fifth gate ancestral grief. This is the grief we carry in our bodies from sorrows experienced by our ancestors. Tending this undigested grief by our ancestors not only frees us to live our own lives, but also eases ancestral suffering in the other world. These gates offer us a way of acknowledging the many ways sorrow enters our lives. In this way, we are able to honor and heal the inevitable times of loss we will each face. Weller's gift lies in bringing soul and community to places that are often met with denial or fear. This helps free us from facing our loss in isolation. The Cancer Help Program is founded on this deep truth. We heal in community. Wherever you find yourself on the path of sorrow, Weller will be a worthy companion, for the simple truth is that great loss is wasted if we do not use it over time to discover what lies beyond great loss. For this, Weller quotes the great naturalist and essayist Terry Tempest Williams. "Grief dares us to love once more." Beautiful. Preface. Grief and loss touch us all. When we gather in community for a grief ritual, the many tributaries of sorrow flow into the room. They swirl around us, touching everyone in the circle. We listen as the faces of loss are named: the death of a partner, a child, a marriage, the suicide of a parent or sibling, cancer and its rapacious consumption of life, a home lost through foreclosure, broken childhoods filled with alcoholism, violence, and neglect, the lingering scars of those who fought in wars, chronic illness that depress and debilitate, lives lost to addiction, and a prevailing sorrow for our struggling world. As we come to the end of the sharing, there is a dawning recognition that this is our shared sorrow, the communal cup from which we all drink. It is ours to hold and to gradually empty. We do this together as we enter the healing ground. For most of our time as a species, the primary association with grief has come through the death of someone we loved. Every culture has crafted rituals to attend to the wild mystery of death and the rainfall of sorrows that accompanies the disappearance of the beloved. Today, however, the sources of loss are multiple, and the complexity of addressing this tangled web of grief can, at times, feel overwhelming. These losses tumble into our lives continually. We sense the presence of loss from places both personal and communal, intimate and shared. What I have come to see is that much of the grief we carry is not personal. It doesn't arise from our histories or experiences. Rather, it circulates around us, coming to us from a wider expanse, arriving on unseen currents that touch our souls. These gates of grief reveal the interpenetrating reality of our time. We are not isolated cells partitioned off from other cells. We have semi-permeable membranes that make possible an ongoing exchange with the great body of life. We register in our psyches, consciously or not, the fact of our shared sorrows. Learning to welcome, hold, and metabolize these sorrows is the work of a lifetime and the focus of this book. Sorrow helps us remember something long intuited by indigenous people across the planet. Our lives are intricately commingled with one another, with animals, plants, watersheds, and soil. For the last several centuries, we have envisioned a split between our inner lives and the surrounding world. Psyche, however, is not confined to the deep interior of our lives. It overlaps with the wider world, and perhaps in these times is most evident in the sorrows and suffering of the earth itself. Our personal experiences of loss and suffering are now bound inextricably with dying coral reefs, melting polar caps, and the silencing of languages, the collapse of democracy, and the fading of civilization. The personal and the planetary are inseparable, as is our healing. Loss binds us together in a potent alchemy, confirming the heart's intimacy with all things. Losing someone or something we love brings us into the shelter of our mutual grief. Grief and love are sisters, woven together from the beginning. Their kinship reminds us that there is no love that does not contain loss, and no loss that is not a reminder of the love we carry for what we once held close. Alone and together, death and loss affect us all. Much has changed since I began leading grief rituals in 1997. At that time, people often expressed a reluctance to gather and share their grief. I had to gently convince people of the value of coming together in a village setting to tend to our sorrows. Today, however, the great rips and tears in the fabric of culture, the cascading crisis of ecological breakdowns, and the loss of our certainty in the continuation of life itself have begun to break through our collective denial. The accumulation of losses are pressing on our psyches and demanding that we engage the multiple sorrows that are unfolding our world and our lives. This crack in our denial is one of the most hopeful signs I see for our planet. We are beginning to take in the wider expanse of loss that is happening in our culture and our ecosystems. In addition to our personal wounds and losses, we are hearing the earth itself calling for our attention and affection, our care and action. Her sorrows are being felt in our bodies. We sense them in our minds and glimpse them in our dreams. The interweaving of personal and planetary losses has left many of us feeling uncertain, anxious, and ultimately heartbroken. Our broken hearts have the potential to open us to a wider sense of identity, one capable of seeing through the partitions that have segregated self from world. Through grief, we are initiated into a more inclusive conversation between our singular lives and the soul of the world. We are coming to understand that there is no isolated self stranded in the cosmos. We are participants in an entwined and entangled net of connections with a continuous exchange of light, air, gravity, thought, color, and sound, all coalescing in the elegant dance that is our shared life. It is the broken heart that can let slip into its core the shimmer of a salmon gliding just under the surface of the water, the startling arc of the swift, the wonder of Mozart, and the sheer beauty of sunrise. We live, however, in a grief-phobic and death-denying society. Consequently, grief and death have been relegated to what psychologist Carl Jung called the shadow. The shadow is the repository of all the repressed and denied aspects of our lives. We send into the shadow the parts of ourselves that we deem unacceptable to ourselves or to others, hoping to disown them. Doing this, we feel we may be spared the discomfort of having to face what has been declared unwelcome. Cultures also send aspects of psychic life into the shadow. Our refusal to acknowledge grief and death has twisted us into a culture riddled with death. One of Jung's more chilling observations was that whatever we put into the shadow doesn't sit there passively waiting to be reclaimed and redeemed. It regresses and becomes more primitive. Consequently, death rattles through our streets daily in school shootings, suicides, murders, overdoses, gang violence, or through the sanctioned sacrifice of war dead. Needless to say, many of us limp through our lives carrying the scars of our death-dealing society. Unfortunately, the fingers of death extend far beyond the streets of our cities. Hillsides are stripped of trees, leaving homeless the countless others who once dwelled within canopies, along creek beds, and in the underbrush. Mountains are destroyed for coal and copper. Oceans are mined and emptied of fish. Creatures who dwell underground in direct conversation with the living earth through their teeth, claws, and bellies are bulldozed away from malls and subdivisions. Death pervades our culture, becoming a presence we cannot contain or ultimately honor. We export our machinery of death to other lands through armadas of weapons, chemicals that poison watersheds, and in our support of tyrannical governments. Many more are caught in the rapacious appetites of corporate profiteers as they loot and plunder indigenous lands for oil and precious commodities, all with our tacit agreement and our denial intact. Bringing grief and death out of the shadow is our spiritual responsibility, our sacred duty. By doing so, we may be able to feel our desire for life once again and remember who we are, where we belong, and what is sacred. I wrote this book for a number of reasons, most notably to restore soul to grief work and grief to soul work. I feel grief has been colonized by the clinical world, taken hostage by diagnoses and pharmaceutical regimes. For the most part, grief is not a problem to be solved, not a condition to be medicated, but a deep encounter with an essential experience of being human. Grief becomes problematic when the conditions needed to help us work with grief are absent. For example, when we are forced to carry our sorrow in isolation, or when the time needed to fully metabolize the nutrients of a particular loss is denied, and we are pressured to return to normal too soon. We are told to get on with it or get over it. The lack of courtesy and compassion surrounding grief is astonishing, reflecting an underlying fear and mistrust of this basic human experience. We must restore the healing ground of grief. We must find the courage once again to walk its wild edge. Grief is always in some way accompanying us. There are times when the presence of sorrow is acute. A partner dies, a home turns to ash in a fire, a marriage dissolves, and we find ourselves alone. These seasons in our lives are intense and require prolonged time to honor what the soul needs, to fully digest the grief. Sorrow is a sustained note in the song of being alive. To be human is to know loss in its many forms. This should not be seen as a depressing truth. Acknowledging this reality enables us to find our way into the grace that lies hidden in sorrow. We are most alive at the threshold between loss and revelation. Every loss ultimately opens the way for a new encounter. In turn, by restoring grief to soul work, we are freed from our one-dimensional obsession with emotional progress. This psychological moralism places enormous pressure on us to always be improving, feeling good, and rising above our problems. Happiness has become the new mecca, and anything short of that often leaves us feeling that we have done something wrong or failed to live up to the acknowledged standard. This forces sorrow, pain, fear, weakness, and vulnerability into the underworld, where they fester and mutate into contorted expressions of themselves, often coated in a mantle of shame. People in my practice routinely apologize for their tears or for feeling sad. I am an advocate for a soul psychology that senses vitality in every emotion, whatever life offers to us in that moment. We will have times of being happy, which is cause for celebration. We will, however, also have times of sorrow and loneliness. Moods will come upon us, and events will occur that evoke anger and outrage in us. In fact, archetypal psychologist James Hillman once noted that being outraged is a sure sign that our soul is awake. Each of these emotions and experiences has vitality in it, and that is our work, to be alive and to be a good host to whoever arrives at the door of our house. Happiness, then, becomes a reflection of our ability to hold complexity and contradiction, to stay fluid and accept whatever arises, even sorrow. I wrote this book to address the two primary sins of Western civilization, amnesia and anesthesia. We forget and we go numb. These two sins account for an amazing range of sorrows. When we are lost in what author Daniel Quinn calls the great forgetting, we slip into a mode of being that neglects the wider bonds of our belonging. We forget that we are all tangled together in the nest of life, that the air we breathe is shared, as is our water and soil, and that everything is bound together in the seamless web of life. When we forget, we are able to do untold damage to our watersheds, to one another, and to our entire earth. Modern technological society has forgotten what it feels like to be embedded in a living culture, one rich with stories and traditions, rituals and patterns of instruction that help us become true human beings. We live in a society with little regard for matters of the soul. As a consequence, we need books and workshops on grief, on relationships and sexuality, on play and creativity. These are symptoms of a great loss. We have forgotten the commons of the soul, the primary satisfactions that sustained and nourished the community and the individual for tens of thousands of years. We have substituted a strange, frenzied oppression with earning a living, one of the most obscene phrases in our world, for the vital and fragrant life of the soul. We have sadly turned the ritual of life into the routine of existence. This forgetting has reduced the arc of our experience down to its tiniest hub. The wider reach of our beings has faded, and the subtle, nuanced gravity of contact with the world has been diminished. This is heartbreaking. Austrian philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein wrote, "What we cannot speak about, we pass over in silence." We have forgotten the primary language of grief. As a consequence, the terrain of sorrow has become unfamiliar and estranged, leaving us confused, frightened, and lost when grief comes near. The haunting silence that Wittgenstein speaks of lingers as a fog over our lives, placing large areas of experience outside of our reach. When our grief cannot be spoken, it falls into the shadow and re-arises in us as symptoms. So many of us are depressed, anxious, and lonely. We struggle with addictions and find ourselves moving at a breathless pace, trying to keep up with the machinery of culture. Our strategies of anesthesia are equally astonishing. Entire industries have emerged to keep the senses dulled and distracted. Our need to be anesthetized is rooted in our smoldering dissatisfaction with the meager existence we have been offered by this society, itself a profound source of grief. We suffer from what the poet William Blake calls divine discontent. Our soul knows we are designed for a bigger, more sensuous, and more imaginative life, but we can go for days, weeks, months, a lifetime with only marginal encounters with beauty in the wild, only rarely sharing an intimate moment with a friend. We collude in the numbing as well, slipping into the void through alcohol, drugs, shopping, television, and work, anything to help us ward off the feelings of emptiness that come crashing at our door. We were not meant to live shallow lives, pocked by meaningless routines and the secondary satisfactions of happy hour. We are the inheritors of an amazing lineage, rippling with memories of life lived intimately with bison and gazelle, raven in the night sky. We are designed to encounter this life with amazement and wonder, not resignation and endurance. This is at the very heart of our grief and sorrow. The dream of full-throated living, woven into our very being, has often been forgotten and neglected, replaced by a societal fiction of productivity and material gain. No wonder we seek distractions. Every sorrow we carry extends from the absence of what we require to stay engaged in this one wild and precious life. And every sorrow is made more difficult to metabolize by that absence. Grief work offers us a trail leading back to the vitality that is our birthright. When we fully honor our many losses, our lives become more fully able to embody the wild joy that aches to leap from our hearts into the shimmering world. Lastly, this book is a prayer, a plea on behalf of our beloved Earth. I write to speak to the deepening sense of loss we are feeling as the life systems of our planet show continuing signs of strain and decline. This pain is intense and almost unendurable. I write for the sake of our communities and for the salmon, ospreys, monarch butterflies, grizzlies, and for the generations to come. This book, then, is an act of remembrance through which our eternal connection to animals and plants, rivers and hills, trees and clouds can be reawakened. It is a gesture of protest calling us back to a life of connection and intimacy, of feeling and wonder. It is an invitation to feed the fires of our aliveness and coax us back to life. All this comes to us through the providence of grief. Every one of us must undertake an apprenticeship with sorrow. We must learn the art and craft of grief, discover the profound ways it ripens and deepens us. While grief is an intense emotion, it is also a skill we develop through a prolonged walk with loss. Facing grief is hard work. It takes the outrageous courage of the Bodhi heart, as Pema Chodron calls it. It takes outrageous courage to face outrageous loss. This is precisely what we are being called to do. Any loss, whether deeply personal or one of those that swirl around us in the wider world, calls us to full-heartedness. For that is the meaning of courage. To honor our grief, to grant it space and time in our frantic world, is to fulfill a covenant with soul, to welcome all that is, thereby granting room for our most authentic life. There is a good deal of evidence that supports our need to work with the difficult emotion of grief, which inevitably finds its way into our lives. An apprenticeship with sorrow offers us the chance to build our capacity to stay present with the intense feelings when the intense feelings of grief arise. Through meaningful rituals, a community of friends, some time in benevolent solitude, and effective practices to help us stretch into our bigger selves, we are offered the opportunity to develop a living relationship with loss. We can recover a faith in grief that recognizes that grief is not here to take us hostage, but instead to reshape us in some fundamental way, to help us become our mature selves, capable of living in the creative tension between grief and gratitude. In doing so, our hearts are ripened and made available for the great work of loving our lives in this astonishing world. It is an act of soul activism. Grief is essential to finding and maintaining a feeling of emotional intimacy with life, with one another, and with our own soul. May you find nourishment in these pages for your soul and for your commitment to stay connected to the sources of life. Francis Weller, Forestville, California, Russian River Watershed. Okay, that was the preface. On to chapter 1.